argument that has been going on for at least 2,500 years. And so you have to, even if you've got a lot of background in something like I do, you still have to approach a task like this with a lot of humility, because you're wading into, I mean, it's like, even having a PhD is like taking a swim in Atlantic Beach and thinking you know something about the ocean, because that you're entering a sea of argumentation that spans generations, spans religions, cultures, all kinds of language groups, and thus I say that to say that there will be many of you in this class who have been studying this material on your own and will have insights about this or that thing in the course of the semester that will be useful for not just mine but everybody else's edification as well. And I don't want you to feel bad about sharing that, because I'm, in comparison, even though I have a PhD in it, I'm a comparative novice in terms of the available material. You could fill this room with just the work in the last 300 years on the book of Genesis. You could pile it all the way to the ceiling. And so, I mean, writing a commentary on Genesis would be like trying to swim across Lake Superior. I mean, it's that the scope of what we're talking about. So I will try to tone down my arrogance as much as I'm possibly able. I'm on medication, so it probably won't happen very much. But I recognize the limits, that I don't know. I don't even begin to know everything, even about the material that I know a huge amount of. I still am at other people's mercy. And so if you have something to contribute that's based on your learnings, don't be afraid to share that perspective, because there's going to be a lot of places where what I know may be just a couple of months ahead of you in terms of academic study, because you can't study all of this material that comprehensively, even though I've been trying to do so for a long time. There's just too much. All right. So the first thing we need to talk about is we need to talk about the canon. What does the word canon mean? Does anybody know? It's a word that comes from the Egyptian word for papyrus, and it means like rule or rod or measuring stick that you would use to measure something by. And the concept of a literary canon is actually a Christian concept that other religious groups have, for lack of a better term, have largely adopted. But we want to talk for just a few minutes about the concept of canon as it relates to the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament, HBOT, because not only do the terms differ between the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, the content of each group's canon is actually different, as we alluded to earlier. The Hebrew Bible within Judaism is commonly known by means of the acronym Tanakh, which is T for Torah, which is the first section of the Hebrew Bible, which are the so-called books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Nevi'im, which are the prophets, and they're within the Jewish canon, the Hebrew Bible is divided up into the former and the latter prophets. The former prophets are what in the Christian tradition would be understood to be the historical books, such as Joshua, Judges, the books of Samuel, and the books of Kings, and the latter prophets are the traditional books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, the three big prophets. And then within Judaism, the so-called minor prophets in Christianity are known as the Book of the 12. So there's four of the latter prophets. And in this construction, the last group is the Ketuvim, that is the writings. Im being the Hebrew plural, so more than one. And the writings are the books that seem to have been canonized or accepted as authoritative last amongst all of the books. And they are books like Job and Esther and Daniel and the Song of Songs and Koheleth, which in the Christian canon is often known as Ecclesiastes. So this division, this ordering of the canon is very intentional, and it has both in its individual constituent parts. There is a theological agenda in the constituent parts, but there is also a theological agenda in the ordering of the material, and you can see the theological agenda in the ordering of the material when you contrast it with the ways in which the way, for example, Protestants would view things, in which the writings would be placed in the middle, and the prophets, so there goes the law, the writings, and the prophets. The prophets are placed at the end. Why in the Christian canon would the prophets be placed at the end rather than in their historic place within Judaism in the middle? Yes?
And for Christians, the prophets would be foretelling the coming of Christ.
Right. So that it's understood. This is the prophets are a kind of launching pad for one to get into messianic ideas that then springboard into the New Testament's accounts of Jesus and Jesus' ministry in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the construction of the canon is very different, not just in its parts, and I'm going to say something about the parts of the Christian canon in just a second, but it's also just the changing in order is also a theological agenda that is on display. There's none of this that is innocent. So there's when the choosing of a book or the ordering of a collection of books, people have an axe to grind. This is not just some sort of natural phenomena that happens. There are people that have made decisions about this material for particular ideological reasons that are peculiar to their particular community. Now, those ideological reasons don't necessarily have to remain static. In other words, we don't have a lot of information, even though the Christian canon is formed. The Christian canon of the New Testament is formed after the Jewish canon was solidified, and those texts were accepted as authoritative. We still don't have access to all of the reasons why the early Christians took certain documents and presented them as canonical, as authoritative, and as being the very Word of God. We don't know all of the reasons why. We have some of the reasons why, but we don't have, even further, we have even less information about why they put them in the order that they did. We can only speculate about that. So whatever their agenda was, and no doubt they had one because they chose a different ordering than what was available within the Jewish community, they had some different ideas than what contemporary people would have today, because most contemporary people haven't even thought about it. Most people in Christianity never even occurred to them that the books might be in a different order, or that how presenting them in a different order might change what they meant. Doesn't occur to people because it is taken as this kind of tacit information. It's just accepted because it's always been that way, and people haven't sat down and spent much time pondering why it became that way. Well, in a class like that's what we do. We look at things and like this, and a lot of times they're painful. Lyndon Johnson's famous dictum. You remember what he said about the two things you don't ever want to see made? Legislation and sausage. Well, to that I would add a third. The other thing you don't want to ever see being made is the canon of your own religion. Because what it does is it exposes the fault lines, the ideological fault lines, that you didn't even realize were there, hadn't even thought about. Because what we tend to do, for those of us who are practitioners, not just of the study of religion, but who are actual believers in a religious tradition, practitioners of that tradition, what we tend to do is simply assume that there was some sort of golden era in which what we believe that there was some time where that was in its more perfect form and where all was sweetness and light, but that somewhere during the historical development of things, that the rails, the project went off the rails, and all of a sudden all kinds of problems came in, and thus the diversity of opinions, and you got different kinds of Jews, and you got different kinds of Christians, and you got different kinds of Muslims, but everybody likes to think and hold to, especially in the religions of Jerusalem, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, those Abrahamic traditions have a tendency to fall into the kind of idyllic imagination of a primeval period when all was the same and everybody believed what was right and just and true and good, but that later people fouled it up. What you find out, though, when you do canonical investigations is there never was such a time. And that what we were always working with, whether it's within any of those traditions, there was always groups going in different directions at once. And that again, remains the same. The distinctions between the different branches of Islam, the different groups within Judaism, the Jews in antiquity, and we'll study this in a number of places. The Jews in antiquity were clawing each other's eyes out. And were viciously mad at one another. Same thing if you study the history of Christianity. The history of Christianity, they were all the way back into the New Testament. Even the apostles themselves didn't like one another. So that they weren't just getting together having a big kumbaya moment. We are the world, and everybody, we are the children, and there's we are the ones who make it, and you can just see Jesus and Peter and Paul, and they're all. That's not how it worked. It never was like that. They didn't like one another, and that's why one of them hung out over here and the other one hung out over there because they didn't agree. Well, the canon and the investigation of the canon sort of highlights that. Now, some of the things going on with the Jewish canon that are important for our discussion that differ from the way that especially Protestants view it. Because there's also, beyond the Protestants, there's also the Catholic and the Orthodox. The Roman Catholic Church, as opposed to the Protestants, have an even different canon from what the Protestants have and what the Jews have. And even there, as Collins points out, the Ethiopian church has even books that are different, but if you went to any of those places and if you asked them if they believe that God speaks through the Scripture, everybody would say yes. That these Scriptures are given to us by the hand of God. But what it was that God gave turns out to be up for grabs. And turns out to be, well, it's like I said earlier, at my church, we believe the truth. And we practice and preach the truth. And that it's at everybody else's house of worship where the error has crept in. And that's kind of how we think. I was raised in a fundamentalist tradition. that believed everybody else was completely stupid and ignorant, and they were all going to hell, including university professors. I mean, I was made scared. Don't go to a state college, because you go to a state college and you'll meet people like what I became, and that was not a good thing. You know, some people would love for their kid to grow up to be a university professor. Not in my denomination. That was, it would be better if I, owned a brothel than to become a university, because at least that there wasn't any pretense, that it was all out there, and nobody was trying to pull a fast one. Whereas university professors, we all meet every year in the basement at Harvard University, and we plot the end of Western civilization, capitalism, and the ruination of Southern womanhood. We have a convention every year in which we do these kinds of things. Well, if you grow up in that kind of tradition, what you think about the canon is rigidly focused toward your own orientation, and you become incapable of the kind of lateral thinking that Collins invites us to, and what we will do a lot of in this class, where you look at what you think about the matter, and if you're a religious practitioner, what your religious tradition might think about the matter, but then you're willing to look over at what your neighbor is doing, and you see, oh, okay, and then you look over at another neighbor, and you see, oh, okay, they have a different understanding. And for a lot of people, that can be the moment where they want to drop the class. Because, and this is my prelude to talking about taking a religion course. Many of you already know this, some of you perhaps don't. But this is one of the distinctives of taking a course in religious studies. And the distinction between religious and scientific thinking is very important. I grew up in a faith-based household where I was encouraged to have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. My father was a minister. My grandfather was a minister. We lived we actually lived in a church basement of a church where my father pastored the church. And my mother would cook pot roast on Sunday, and if my dad's sermon went too long, the pot roast would burn, and the entire church knew it, because everybody could smell it coming up through the... I'm not joking. That was actually my life. So I grew up in a God-intoxicated world. Well, in religious thinking, what does religious thinking ask questions about? They don't ask about what's in the Jewish canon, or what the Ethiopians think about the book of Daniel, or Bel and the Dragon. They don't ask questions like that. When you go to a church or other religious community, you're interested in answering questions. How do I find and know God? How do I have a better marriage? How do I deal with my child who's got a drug problem? How do I deal with my difficult boss? How do I deal with my own illness or my own parents' aging and illness? How do I deal with all of the vicissitudes of life? How do I deal with change in general? That's what people join and participate in religious community to find answers to out of their texts with other people, sometimes in the context of sermons and in other traditions, in other ways. That's how religions function in people's lives. In scientific thinking, the exact opposite is the case. Scientific thinking is interested in the who, what, where, how, when, and why. Those kinds of questions that are not necessarily better questions. They just have a different sphere of interest. They have a different sphere of information, and thus they cover a different aspect, an essential aspect of the human project. And in this class, we try to balance those two in terms of acknowledging and respecting people's faith traditions and faith questions, but at the same time privileging, when it comes to testing and assignments and that sort of thing, to privileging not those kind of faith-based questions, however important they may be, but in order to answer the kinds of questions, the who, what, where, how, when, and why. And what what we do when we look at the canon thus becomes often upsetting to people and makes folks, a lot of times very, very anxious and very nervous because they signed up for this Old Testament class thinking, well, I got organic chemistry, I got advanced calculus, I got accounting 4. Maybe I'll take an easy one. This Old Testament thing, I went to church all my life. I'll take this Old Testament class because it'll be a breeze. It's not true. Set that up, and so I say all that on the first night so that people can realize where we're going with this information. That we're not trying to make fun of a faith-based approach. I would be the last person who'd want to do that because I'm all about a faith-based approach in my own personal life. But here, wearing my university professor hat, I'm thinking about it in different terms. Now, do you have any questions about that? Because it's really important that you understand the distinction before we go any further. All right, you got so many veterans in here. And please don't be afraid to ask a question if you're not sure about what the answer is, even if you think everybody in the room does, because there may be 27 people in the room who are thinking that everybody else in the room has, already knows the answer when nobody does, but nobody wants to say because they don't want to be humiliated by, the university professor who has a cabal going in the Harvard University basement. All right, so back to the canon of the Hebrew Bible. What we know about the Hebrew Bible's canonization is that the Tanakh was canonized in this order. That the Torah was canonized first, and we know that because we actually have references in the canon itself to the law, self-consciously reflecting on the law from the Psalms, but most importantly from the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is one of the books of the former prophets in the Hebrew Bible. It's placed towards the end of the Christian Bible in the Old Testament, but in the Hebrew Bible, it's with the former prophets. And Ezra and Nehemiah has a section in it. It's the family values section, and I'm being very facetious because Ezra comes back to the land. It's the exile is over. Ezra comes back to the land, and Ezra finds all of these people that had been that were the Jewish community had largely intermarried with their Gentile neighbors, and they had made all kinds of little mixed race babies or mixed religion babies, and this was very disturbing to Ezra because the distinctiveness of the Jewish religion was, in his view, going to be watered down by the intermarriage with the outsiders who were going to diminish the faith of the people and thus take the people down a particular theological and political path that they ought otherwise not go if they had married with inside the group instead of outside the group. And in order to bring about the change, Ezra calls the elders and has them all given copies of the law. And the way that the passage is presented in the book of Nehemiah, because remember, Ezra and Nehemiah are one text in the Hebrew Bible. The way that it is presented is that this is the presentation of the law to these folks seems to be a novum, a novelty, something they'd not experienced before. And the elders of the people are then commanded to stand up and read the law, read the Torah in front of all the people. And so obviously you can't, there's no amplification system, no microphones, so you have to get around a cluster of people around you, and you read the Torah and all the people hear it. Well, what happens when they read the Torah? Oh my goodness. They can't believe it. Listen to what that says. We've sinned. We've done awful. God must be so upset with us. What are we going to do? How can we possibly redeem ourselves? I mean, it's like they've never even thought of this before. And so Ezra says, well, what you need to do is you need to kick these Gentile women and these little half-caste babies. You need to kick them to the curb. And I mean, that's literally what happens. And I mean, all of a sudden, there's a big breakup of all of these families, and it's based on this understanding of the strict requirements of Yahweh's Torah that demand a level of holiness and righteousness among the people that would not allow them to water down their religious beliefs or to water down the commitment that they have to following this particular path that God has laid out for them. And thus they decide that they're going to follow the Torah and be faithful to the originary message as it has now just been presented to them by Ezra. So we have references like that to the law, and it is understood at that time that apparently, and this is the standard scholarly view, it's understood by scholars to be this is the sort of the moment in Israel's history. Actually, it's Judah's history because it's the southern tribes. In Judah's history, where the law is accepted as authoritative, and that from then on, at least from then on, you're dealing with a fixed set of ideas and texts that though they may change somewhat, have a large degree of regularity to them. Because once something is at the level of an authority, you just don't tamper with it willy-nilly. All right. Because if it's so long as it's not the Word of God, you can do whatever you want with it. But once it becomes the Word of God, you don't break out your text editor and start marking it up, and sending your changes back and say this would be much better if it was 10 chapters shorter or something. Now, just like we have that kind of self-conscious reference in Ezra and Nehemiah to the law, we also have self-conscious references in texts like the wisdom of Ben Sira, or as it's known in the Apocrypha as the book Sirach. And what we have there is the introduction for the first time of the phrase the law and the prophets. And thus, and the wisdom of Ben Sira is not from the 5th century the way that Ezra and Nehemiah is. It's from the 3rd century and BCE. And the appearance of that phrase, the law and the prophets, afterward, it starts appearing everywhere. So whenever you wouldn't talk about the Bible, you talk about the law and the prophets, the Torah and the Nevi'im. And thus when you get even into the New Testament, when the New Testament writers talk about the Bible, what do they refer to it as? They don't call it the Bible. They refer to it as the law and the prophets, because that is the term of the era in which they live. Now, what that is taken by scholars to mean is that this last section is actually from a later period. So, whereas Ezra is in like 5th century BCE on your timeline, and Sirach is in 3rd century BCE, your timeline moving this way, 3rd century BCE. What you have down here, so you have the law and you have the prophets. Then what you have down here is it's not until you get to the end of the 1st century, and it's not BCE, it's CE, that is of the Common Era, rather than before the Common Era. It's only then that you get the writings that are included in the list of texts that within the Jewish community are understood to be authoritative. Now that's the way that the Jewish community construes it. Now, the way that the Protestants construe it, as I said, is to flip these two, with some exceptions. For example, the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel in the Christian canon is placed with the other so-called minor prophets. That is the book of the 12 within Judaism. But Daniel is not written at a time period. Daniel is written sometime in the 160s. That is too late to be in the prophets. So he's about a half century too late at 160. So the Jewish community puts Daniel not as a prophetic book, but as one of the writings, as one of the Ketuvim. That's a very important distinction for purposes of apocalyptic. You were talking about writing the paper on apocalyptic literature? The canonical placement of the book of Daniel within Judaism, as opposed to Christianity, has radically affected the interpretation of the book of Daniel, because if you read Daniel as apocalyptic as opposed to prophecy, you'll get a completely different Daniel, and you'll get a completely different interpretation about what the community thinks is going on in the world. If you read it as predictive prophecy, you'll get the Left Behind game and rock stars, drug dealers, and university professors needing to be converted or killed. That's who wrote the Left Behind game, was people who read the book of Daniel as being predictive prophecy, not apocalyptic. And we'll talk about those kinds of literatures as the semester unfolds. I don't have time to go into them right now tonight, but right now what you need to get is the distinction between the way the Jewish community looks at the text and the way that the Christian community looks at the text. And mostly it's by the flipping of the writings and the prophets. Do you have any questions about this? I can't be that clear. All right. You're just being shy. All right. Now the Roman Catholic Church has a set of books that are based on some books that ended up in something called the Septuagint. This is one of those words that you need to learn right now. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was put together about 250 BCE in Alexandria, we think. Because there was a large contingent under the Greeks. The Greeks were very friendly. This is what I always say. They were the Ptolemies. Ptolemy. P-T-O-L, yeah, Ptolemy. The Ptolemies were tolerant. That's a joke, by the way. You got it? Okay. Which meant that they did not have a very strong pro-Greek orientation. They did not feel the need to cause everybody under their sphere of influence to bow down and worship their gods, to get rid of their ethnic ways, their religious practices, their language, etc. They didn't feel the need to do that the way that other ancient empires did, the way that certain other Greek tribes did, such as the Seleucid Greeks, who were later on going to take over the land of Yehud, or Judah, from the Ptolemies. But in the 3rd century, after the death of Alexander the Great, who dies without leaving an heir, his successors fight it out. And the Ptolemies get control of Judea, Yehud, it goes by various names depending on the time period, get control of Judah, and are in control of North Africa as well, the whole of what we now consider the Empire of Egypt. And under that tolerant set of policies, many Jews moved from the traditional Jewish homeland down into Alexandria, or because we don't know exactly how it happened, or many Egyptians converted to Judaism because there was probably some of both that went on, because Judaism was originally a missionary religion, and we have evidence of Jewish missionary activity all over the Mediterranean basin for several centuries around this time, and there was such that there was a substantial Jewish community in and around the city of Alexandria. And what happens over several generations? The kids and the grandkids of immigrants, they stop knowing the native language, right? So they don't know their Hebrew anymore, and they're all on Twitter all the time, and they're on Facebook, and they're using all these kind of slang terms. Well, so they don't know how to read the Scripture. So apparently, the Jewish community, under the direction of one of the Ptolemies, has the Scripture, the Law and the Prophets, translated from Hebrew into Greek, such that their children, the Jewish children living in the Greek-speaking diaspora, could understand what was actually being said in their own religious texts, so that they could participate in the house of worship, the synagogue, which was where if you lived in Yehud, you would worship in the temple in Jerusalem. But if you lived out in the larger Mediterranean basin, you'd worship in a Jewish house of worship, a synagogue. And when the scripture passage would be read, you could now have it read in the language that you understood if you were one of these Greek-speaking Jews. What the Septuagint is that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was supposedly translated by 72 scholars, and who amazingly, according to the legend, all came up with the same translation. Tell me from a functional perspective, what's the purpose of that story?
Peer review.
Peer review. Why you need it, right? Very good. How would that benefit to tell a story? Why would the community want to tell a story like that? Yes?
If it's believed that everyone, all 72, came up with the exact same translation, then it must be divine and it must be accurate, and this must be the law that we must abide by.
Right, because there would likely have been a lot of pushback from traditionalists whenever anybody tries to introduce a new translation of anything into any religious community. You always get pushback from people. Mel Gibson and his father are still wanting to go back and undo the Second Vatican Council, where the Mass was put in the vernacular and taken out of the Latin. And there are still pockets of traditionalist Catholics around the world that do not like the Mass in any other language but one they don't understand, because that's the language that they grew up with. And that's what they believe is the appropriate norm. This is that story is designed to help people overcome their anxiety at having a translation of the Bible that differs from the Hebrew. Now, the Septuagint did not just contain, well, first of all, it contained the Law and the Prophets. But over time, it began to include other things as well, and ended up including, you could get, as the centuries rolled by, you could get the writings in a copy of the Septuagint, and you could get a whole list of other books that come to be known as the Apocrypha. such as 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the wisdom of Ben Sira. There's no blood getting to my brain. What are the some other in Catholics in the house? No Catholics. Nobody knows the Apocrypha. I'm just drawing a blank. I mean, it's
Judith.
Judith, yes. Tobit, yes. So you have these other books, and when yes. Esther. Well, Esther is in the writings in both in Judaism, and it's in the poetic books of the Christian Bible. The Protestants have that too.
Sophia.
I'm sorry.
Sophia.
No.
Like Enoch and Jubilee?
Wisdom.
Yeah. So, but you get the point. There are other texts that the Septuagint becomes this larger text, and it is that version of the Septuagint that ends up becoming the Roman Catholic canon. That is not just the law and the prophets, not just the wisdom literature or the writings, but also the apocryphal books. When the Protestants make their canon later in the 17th century, they accept just these, but omit that. So you get this. Although what they've done, they still have done the switch. And in the Catholic Bible, they've also made the same switch where the Gospels have the prophets right next to them rather than the prophets being in the middle of the Bible. So you have all of these different groups of people arguing. Remember what I said about you're wading into an argument? The choice of the books is just the beginning, and the ordering of the books is just the beginning of the argument. We haven't even talked about the actual text themselves. But now we're going to for just a few minutes. Do you have any questions about this? All of this is detailed in there are charts in columns, and the charts are also in the Kindle version as well. So you can see them in both the Kindle and the textbook version. Let's take just a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll finish up, and I'm going to say something about the text. Okay? I just want to say a couple of things. I've been talking for the last 45 minutes about the books and the ordering of the canon. I just want to say a few things about the manuscripts. Now, the manuscript evidence that we have is it's not a great deal from the Old Testament / Hebrew Bible. It's much more common to have manuscripts within the Christian tradition from the New Testament, obviously because Christianity's texts are newer than the texts of the Hebrew Bible. But we do have a considerable number. And since 1948, with the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, we've got an even larger database. What we had was basically our oldest manuscripts were from about 1000 to 1100 CE. And all of the modern texts were all based on using the manuscript evidence from this period right here. And it didn't matter whether you were using the NRSV, whatever version of the Bible it was. They all were using basically the same handful of texts. What happened in 1948 when that Palestinian kid threw the rock into the cave, and instead of it going clunk, it went clink because it hit a pot. This is the legend. Well, that changed everything. Because what happened then was that instead of having manuscripts from 1000 CE, instead, all of a sudden, we had manuscripts that dated from 200 to about 200 BCE to 70 CE. And there were a whole bunch of them. and the manuscripts that we had from here were almost all different from what the manuscripts were that were used at the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what we also had from in between this period was another track of manuscripts. We had copies. This is of the Hebrew. So these are we're talking about Hebrew manuscripts that were the basis of the Hebrew Bible translations of modern times. What we also had were Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, of the Septuagint. And sometimes when we would come to a place where the Septuagint would disagree with the 11th century Hebrew manuscript, many times the scholars would take, even though it was in Greek and it wasn't in the original Hebrew, many times scholars would take the Greek, because the Greek would be, say, 500-600 years earlier than the Hebrew, and believing that there was actually, at some point at the time that this Septuagint manuscript was produced, that there was a Hebrew copy that they were working from, that they weren't just making words up. And in fact, that hypothesis that was used by translators quite frequently, that hypothesis was confirmed, and then some, by the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they found in Hebrew the manuscripts that the Septuagint was operating on with that were different from these. So that what you had was multiple tracks then. So you had another track of Hebrew text. So you had two layers of Hebrew text and a Greek text, and oftentimes this one would be the odd one out, and these would be the ones that would carry the day, because the Septuagint would agree with the Dead Sea Scrolls against what had been previously in your English translation that was in your Pew Bible all the way up into the 1970s. So it's impossible to overestimate the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, if you think that the process of looking at how your religious tradition's canon is composed, it gets even worse when you start looking at the actual manuscript and the evidence itself, and looking at the words, because the words become very, very difficult at times. Most of the time it's not. Most of the time there's a lot of clarity. But you have situations where even in just one manuscript, you'll have a situation where a manuscript will have had written over it, a manuscript will have this letter written, and then you'll have it kind of scratched out a little bit, and another letter put on top of it, but where under a microscope or other analysis you can tell what the first letter was. And then you'll have situations where you'll have this one struck through, and on top of it, in between the lines, you'll have somebody who will have written Z. And then you'll have, on your manuscript page, you'll have somebody over here who wrote, no, it's really A. Okay, well, so this is then you find your Joe or Josephine Bible scholar, and you get this, you've been assigned the book of Deuteronomy to translate for the new Revised Standard Version, and you come to a passage like this. Which one do you pick? And why? Well, I mean, you got four possibilities.
And go with the oldest.
There's develops criteria. One criteria is like the harder reading, so that the worst one is probably the most likely one, because everybody else is trying to make up for it. That's one criteria. Or the worst one can just be a mistake. It can be that that person couldn't spell or had bad grammar, and everybody knew he had bad, and so we're just proposing what that one might have been intending when he wrote the correction on top of the original letter. But you see, there's no real way to tell when you get down to the level of the words and the actual letters of the words what the actual words always are. And remember that biblical Hebrew is written with no vowels. And so it's written, and it's on a page, it's written from right to left. It's written like this. And then the next line is just written, right like that, and it's just one letter after the other, one consonant. There's no word breaks. It's just because there's no spaces between words. There's no punctuation. All of those things are added later during the Common Era by a rabbinic group known as the Masoretes, and thus the name, the Masoretic text, is a text that has a series of the creation of vowels, of dots and dashes above and below the line that would tell you what a letter was. You would know. You'd read a consonant and pick up a vowel. Sometimes it'd be a closed consonant, so then you go to this one. You have to have a schwa or something. So you'd read like this, a Masoretic text. You start at the line, you go below the line, above the line, and read up and down, up and down, up and down like that, trying to fill in the vowels. Now, if you really know Hebrew well, you can read an unpointed text. But, you have to have labored long in the field. Imagine reading an unvoweled, novel in English. You've been reading English all your life. Many of you are about to be college graduates. Some of you already are college graduates. Some of you even here have graduate degrees. If I gave you Anna Karenina with no vowels, first place it would be nunna. Would you be able to even tell what it was? So it's often very difficult to tell not just what the word is, but where the word stops. Because sometimes the what looks like the end of one word may actually be the beginning of the next word. And if you divide it up, it makes a big difference whether this is a word and this is a word, or whether all of it's a word. You see what I'm saying? And the manuscript doesn't tell you. But your translation is based on how you divide that up and where you put the vowels, what vowels you put in there, because by the changing of the vowels, even if you have the same consonants, you may have different vowels, and the different vowels could signify a completely different word that's very closely related, but still a different word. So you have to be able to understand the context so clearly that you know what's being said, and you know to supply what vowels, and you know where the words break, and so on. None of that is clear, and nobody does it the same way, which is why when you do Bible translation, not only are you getting the inherent bias theologically and politically of the translator, we've already talked about that. You're also getting the bias of just the general understanding of the Hebrew and what the grammar and syntax of a particular passage may be indicating is the original form of the text, as well as which one of the manuscripts, whether we're going to follow X, Y, Z, or A, which one of those readings we're going to follow, and depending on whether you divide the word up the same, and depending on whether you point the vowels the same, and depending on which one of the letters you choose for X, Y, Z, or A, you could end up with, just with those three variables, you could end up with a dozen or more different translations of a particular word. All of which then gets to the issue of talking about this material as the very Word of God. Because remember, this, as we said at the very outset, even though we're looking at this historically, this text functions not just as a historical item for people to study abstractly or intellectually in a religion class. It also functions as Scripture. But how you construe these kinds of things will also say something about your understanding of biblical, of the way in which the Bible functions as the Word of God. For conservative Protestants, for example, there is a belief in the verbal inspiration of the Bible. That is, God gave the words. Well, was it X, Y, Z, or A is the one that God gave? I mean, this is the problem. And when you don't know when you don't know where to break the word, I mean, okay, God gave that, but what did it mean? And if you don't know what vowels go, whether it's the vowels for one word or the vowels for another word, what does it mean then to talk about God giving the word and speaking the words to the people? It becomes more complicated than that if you actually know Hebrew, because and if you know anything about the textual criticism of Hebrew manuscripts, which is what we're talking about now, there are people that spend their whole lives trying to figure out this.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is that where the Strong's Concordance comes into play?
Well, it can, but Strong's Concordance has already decided what the vowels are and where the words break up. Strong's has decided, and Strong's will tell you, this is this Hebrew word. Even though Strong's is not operating, Strong's is having to decide where the vowels go. But Strong's doesn't know that. That's the part that if you get a Strong's Concordance that they don't tell you, is that Strong is the one who's telling you this is what the word is, and so then he can tell you what it means after he's already told you, he's already decided what it is. Because you can get from the same consonants, you can get a whole bunch of different words. And if you put those consonants in a line with a whole bunch of other consonants, you can have all kinds of things. And every line, page after page after page, or scroll after scroll after scroll, all of those things become, you multiply millions and millions and millions and millions of variables involved in each different group's translation, and thus what you find is that people are working with a kind of a theory of their translation, and with a kind of proclivity towards reading. If they see this vowel pattern or they see this consonant pattern, they're usually going to read it as this. If they see this consonant pattern, they're going to read it as that, and so on. Whereas their neighbor may read that same pattern completely different, and neither one can be shown to be wrong, because all you've got are the consonants. You see what I'm saying? So you can't say a pox on your house because you're a heretic, and you don't. We believe the Bible in my church. We believe the Bible from cover to cover. We even believe the cover.
But with Hebrew, there's no vowel characters. So
right.
And the way I was raised.
Well, they were created only about 1,500 years ago.
But the
original manuscripts had no vowels.
Exactly. I know, but the characters, certain Hebrew character combinations, would not make sense either way.
Right, because there are some things.
No matter the combination of the A-E-I-O-U sounds,
right?
It just wouldn't make sense. So you can distinguish what.
Some of them you can. Well, some of them you can.
I've never had a problem.
But some of them you can't. Well, you haven't studied it long enough in Hebrew. Let me just put it to you that way. I mean, bluntly. I mean, there are plenty of places where you can't tell, where it's not clear, because the one word can be the end of one or the beginning of another, and it will make. And you can read, if you read the notes, you read the translation notes, you can see why scholars get different readings of the same passage, because they're both providing legitimate readings. They're not wrong. Neither one of them is, and you can't falsify either one. I know there are some that if you substituted something, even though it may be an actual word, it would be completely nonsense and gobbledygook if you read it like that. But I'm talking about places where it does make sense and where there's not a
There's not
any
an
way to
eam
tell.
at the end or an oat. Or
Right,
something that
right. Where it's
denotes a
obviously
certain-
it's a plural, masculine or feminine. Because it's the beginning of the next word,
Gotcha.
and it's those places are not like they're not on every page, but they're not rare either. They're there, and they're. I mean, I spent a whole graduate course doing those sorts of things until I was ready to pull the 4 hairs I have left out of my head because they're maddening. It's and you go around a room of graduate students. Everybody in the room is a first-rate biblical scholar, and everybody would have a different read. And then the professor would tell us what the answer was after he would listen to us all flail. But I mean, I say that tongue in cheek because the professor couldn't tell any better than we could of what the difference was. So.
Well, it's kind of an obvious how there really are no vowels in Hebrew language. Vowels were added so that it would make sense in other languages. It's kind of like if you're looking at the Quran, how there are 2 spellings of it. You can get Q, it's like K-A and then Q-U or Q-O. I'm not sure which one it is, what one is correct. But the whole point is that Hebrew, it's such a guttural language. It's also like when you look at the word Thomas, when you translate it, it's why some people spell CH or H. It's all depending on just trying to make it into a language that everyone else can read.
Right, but if you're talking about which, and for the most part it's intelligible. But if you're making a theological claim about God giving the words, that is verbal inspiration, you're making a claim of a whole other different order than what you're talking about. So you're saying something about the Bible that is of a completely different character than just saying we do our best to try to figure out what the words are, but we can't get at all of it. That is not acceptable for anybody who believes in verbal inspiration. Because it all has to be, God had to have God's intent on it, and God has to speak through it. That's the essence of verbal inspiration theology, which is typical of the churches that I grew up with in my particular theological background, where that's what I grew up in my church believing. That's what my father and grandfather both believed and preached their entire careers. Yes?
When the Hebrew scribes copy the Torah, the scroll, and I've been told that if they make one mistake, they have to start over.
Right.
What are they copying? Each one is copying back to a certain...
Well, see, that's the thing. That's the thing. What it looks like is that what it looks like is that there are, remember I had the multiple tracks? There's the Greek track, there's the Hebrew, then there's multiple Hebrew tracks, and they're each one is following some sort of exemplar that they believe they're following the original true and living way, but that we don't have a way of getting behind that process. We don't have an original manuscript to know where the divergence came in. You see what I'm saying? We have the same problem with New Testament manuscripts. There are 4 different families of New Testament manuscripts, broadly construed, that are all working off of the same proclivities, and they have the same kinds of ticks and pops. And if you've looked at them long enough, you can see it. But in that, we can't get behind those 4 to tell which was the first one, because we don't have the first one. All you can do beyond that is by guess and by golly. But that's a problem if you believe in verbal inspiration, because you can't have multiple tracks. I mean, the psalm, there was either 150 psalms Well, there wasn't. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls copy of the Book of Psalms has more than 150. Has different songs in it. Has more different ones than the one that the Dead Sea Scrolls copy of the Book of Jeremiah is like 25% shorter than the manuscript from the 11th century. Which is the original one? It's not a problem if you don't believe in verbal inspiration, but it is if you do. Doesn't mean it's not doable. It just means it presents a problem that you got to work through if you want to have that view. And it's just and Collins talks a little bit about it. I won't go any further into it than that, just because we're getting really inside baseball, deep in the weeds, whatever metaphor you want to use. But these are the problems in trying to figure out exactly what the text says. Most of it is not a problem. 99% of it is probably not a problem. It's just that the other one little part that's the irritating part that they make you do exercises in grad school on. All right. Again, because people came in different times, we had storms, I'm going to let you go without taking attendance, but this will be the last time. So, it's been crazy. It's been real. It's been fun. It's been real.